I had been hiking for years, long enough to know that the mountains didn't forgive careless people. Every trip started the same way, checking the forecast twice, downloading offline maps, carrying extra food and water, and leaving my route with someone back home. That's probably why what happened that October afternoon still bothers me more than anything else in my life, because I did everything right. The trail I chose was part of a national forest that wasn't particularly famous, which was exactly why I liked it. Most hikers stayed near the popular overlooks, but I preferred the older paths that wound through dense pine forests, where you could walk for an hour without seeing another person. It was cold enough that my breath lingered in front of me, but not uncomfortable. Fallen leaves covered sections of the trail, and the only sounds were the wind pushing through the treetops and the occasional crack of branches shifting somewhere deeper in the woods. I reached the trailhead just after 9 in the morning. There were only 3 other vehicles parked there, which wasn't unusual for a weekday. An older couple were unloading backpacks from an SUV, and a younger guy wearing bright orange hiking gear nodded at me before heading toward a different trail. I signed the registration log, noted my planned route, and started walking. For the first couple of hours, everything was exactly what I'd hoped for. The trail climbed gradually through thick forest before opening onto rocky ridges overlooking miles of untouched wilderness. Around noon, I stopped beside a stream to eat a sandwich and refill one of my water bottles using my filter. While I sat there, I heard footsteps approaching behind me. A man in his late 40s appeared around the bend carrying a large pack. He smiled politely and asked if I'd seen anyone else on the trail. I told him I'd passed a few people near the parking lot that morning, but hadn't seen anyone since. He thanked me, said he was looking for a shortcut to an abandoned fire lookout, then continued uphill. Something about the conversation felt slightly off, though I couldn't explain why. His clothes looked expensive and well-maintained, but his backpack was almost empty, hanging oddly flat against his shoulders. More importantly, he wasn't carrying any water. Experienced hikers notice little things like that. Still, I convinced myself he probably knew what he was doing better than I did. About 40 minutes later, I reached an intersection marked by an old wooden sign. One direction led toward the summit overlook. The other disappeared into a narrow trail marked "Closed for Maintenance." A faded piece of orange tape fluttered from the signpost, but it looked old enough to have been hanging there for years. I checked my map and confirmed that my route stayed on the open trail, so I kept moving. That's when I heard someone whistle. It was a short, sharp whistle from somewhere behind me. I turned around expecting to see another hiker, but the trail was empty. The forest was so still that I could hear water trickling somewhere below the hill. I waited a few seconds before shrugging it off. Birds can make strange sounds, and echoes in the mountains play tricks on you. About 15 minutes later, the whistle came again, this time much closer. I spun around immediately. Still nobody. I walked back 50 yards just to be sure, scanning between the trees. Nothing. I laughed quietly to myself, embarrassed that I was letting my imagination get involved. By early afternoon, clouds had rolled over the mountains, dimming the sunlight beneath the canopy. The temperature dropped enough that I zipped up my jacket. I checked my GPS and estimated I had another 2 hours before reaching the loop back toward the parking area. That's when I noticed fresh footprints crossing the trail ahead of me. They weren't animal tracks. They were heavy boot prints leading from one side of the forest to the other. I crouched to examine them. The soil was still damp where the boots had pressed into it, meaning whoever made them had crossed only minutes earlier. Oddly, they didn't follow the trail. They simply entered the woods on one side and disappeared into thick brush on the other. I kept walking, telling myself it wasn't unusual for hunters or park workers to move off trail. 10 minutes later, I found another set of footprints. Same size, same tread pattern. Again, crossing directly over the path. Then another. It was almost as if someone was walking back and forth across the trail instead of traveling along it. My confidence began slipping away. I stopped several times, listening carefully. At first there was nothing except wind. Then I heard what sounded like a branch snapping somewhere uphill. I called out, asking if someone was there. No answer. I continued walking faster. A mile later, I reached an old wooden bridge crossing a narrow ravine. Halfway across, I happened to glance downstream and froze. Standing beneath the bridge, partially hidden behind a cluster of fallen trees, was the same man I'd spoken to near the stream earlier. He wasn't hiking anymore. He wasn't moving at all. He was simply standing there, looking directly up at me with the same calm expression he'd worn hours earlier. I lifted one hand in an awkward wave, expecting him to respond, but he didn't. He just stared. The silence felt unbearable. After several seconds, I hurried across the bridge without looking back. Once I reached the other side, curiosity got the better of me. I turned around. The space beneath the bridge was empty. There was nowhere he could have gone that quickly without making noise. My heart was pounding now, but I kept telling myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe he'd climbed out of sight. Maybe I simply hadn't noticed another trail. I forced myself to continue toward the loop. Less than 5 minutes later, my phone vibrated with a low battery warning despite being almost fully charged when I started the hike. The GPS froze. The offline map disappeared. Then, from somewhere ahead of me on the trail, I heard the exact same voice I'd spoken hours before call out my name. Even though I had never told that man what my name was, the voice called my name with such casual confidence that, for a second, I actually answered before catching myself. "Hello?" My own voice sounded strangely small beneath the trees. Silence followed. Not the peaceful kind you expect in the woods, but the uncomfortable silence that makes every heartbeat seem louder than it should be. I stood frozen, staring down the narrow trail ahead. It curved around a cluster of boulders and disappeared into dense pine trees. There was nobody there. I looked behind me toward the bridge, expecting to see the man following me, but the trail remained empty in both directions. My first thought was that maybe he'd seen the registration log at the trailhead. My name had been written there along with everyone else's. It was the only explanation that made sense, yet something about it still bothered me. The packing area had been nearly empty when I arrived, and he hadn't been anywhere near the logbook while I signed it. Besides, if he wanted my attention, why disappear every time I looked for him? I forced myself to keep walking, telling myself that the quickest way out was to finish the loop instead of turning back. The trail descended through thicker forest where sunlight barely reached the ground. Fallen needles muffled my footsteps, making it difficult to judge whether the faint crunching noises behind me were mine or someone else's. After several minutes, I stopped abruptly. A second later, another footstep echoed somewhere behind me. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct enough that my stomach tightened. I spun around. Nothing, just rows of identical tree trunks stretching into the distance. I listened carefully. No birds, no wind. Then another soft crunch, this time from my left. I stepped off the trail and peered between the trees. About 70 yards away, I caught a glimpse of movement. Someone ducked behind a large pine. It happened so quickly that I questioned whether I'd imagined it, but the shape had been unmistakably human. I shouted. "Are you okay?" No reply came back. I wasn't interested in playing games, so I returned to the trail and increased my pace. Every instinct told me to get back to the parking lot as quickly as possible. 20 minutes later, I reached a small clearing with an old campsite that had clearly been abandoned for years. The rusted remains of a fire ring sat in the center, surrounded by broken logs and weathered beer cans. I stopped long enough to catch my breath and drink some water. That's when I noticed fresh cigarette smoke drifting through the air. I couldn't see anyone, but the smell was unmistakable. It hadn't been there a moment earlier. Someone nearby had either just lit a cigarette or had been standing there only seconds before I arrived. My pulse quickened again. I scanned the clearing carefully until I spotted something lying beside one of the logs. It was a black knit cap, clean, dry, recently dropped. I crouched to examine it without touching it. Before I could stand back up, a voice behind me calmly said, "You shouldn't pick up things that aren't yours." I turned so fast I nearly lost my balance. The same man stood less than 20 feet away between two trees. He wore the same hiking clothes and carried the same nearly empty backpack. This time he smiled, though it never reached his eyes. "You startled me," I said, trying to sound calm. "Didn't hear you walk up." "You weren't supposed to," he replied. The answer was so strange that I didn't know how to respond. He glanced toward the trail I'd been following. "That way's blocked. Big tree came down. You'll want to take the old service road instead." He pointed toward a narrow path disappearing into thick brush. I looked where he was pointing. There was no trail marker, no sign, nothing indicating it was an official route. "My map doesn't show that," I said. "Maps get old." He smiled again. "Trust me." Every warning bell in my head went off at once. I thanked him anyway, shouldered my pack, and continued on the marked trail instead. As I walked away, I resisted the urge to look back. About 200 yards later, I finally did. He was gone. There hadn't been enough time for him to disappear naturally. The forest around me suddenly felt impossibly large. I pulled out the emergency whistle attached to my backpack strap and kept it in my hand. The trail eventually climbed toward another ridge where I expected to regain a cell signal. Instead, I found something even stranger. Parked beside a maintenance gate was an old pickup truck with no license plates. The driver's door hung open. No one was inside. The engine was cold, but muddy footprints surrounded the vehicle. Several of them led toward the woods. Others stopped abruptly near the passenger side, as if whoever made them had climbed into another vehicle that was no longer there. I debated leaving a note or checking the truck for identification, but another instinct told me not to touch anything. I hurried past it and finally reached a point where my phone briefly displayed a single bar of service. Before I could dial 911, the signal vanished again. I shoved the phone back into my pocket and kept moving downhill. The parking area couldn't be more than 2 miles away now. I repeated that thought over and over, using it to stay focused. Then I rounded one final bend and came to a complete stop. Across the trail, stretched tightly between two trees at chest height, was a length of nearly invisible fishing line. Hanging from it was my own trail registration, tagged the one I had signed at the parking lot that morning. Someone had removed it from the trailhead, carried it miles into the forest, and left it there waiting for me. Behind the tag, nailed to a tree with a hunting knife, was a handwritten note containing only 4 words. "You turned around twice." I stared at the note for several seconds before I even realized I had stopped breathing. My hands felt numb as I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, hoping the signal had returned, but the screen still showed no service. The words on the paper weren't a threat by themselves. They weren't even particularly violent. What made them terrifying was how specific they were. I had turned around exactly twice since leaving the bridge. Once after hearing footsteps, and once after walking away from the man at the abandoned campsite. Whoever wrote that note had been watching me the entire time. I looked in every direction, trying to spot movement between the trees, but the forest was perfectly still. My first instinct was to run, but years of hiking had taught me how dangerous panic could be on uneven terrain. I forced myself to think. Someone wanted me to know I was being followed. That meant they either wanted to scare me away or lure me into making a mistake. Neither option ended well if I lost control. I stepped carefully over the fishing line without touching it, leaving the note exactly where it was. If this ever became a police investigation, I didn't want to contaminate anything. The trail descended sharply toward the valley where the parking area should have been less than a mile away. I walked as quickly as I safely could, stopping every few minutes to listen. Several times I heard faint movement behind me, but every time I turned I found only empty forest. After another 10 minutes I caught the distant sound of an engine. Relief washed over me. It had to be the parking lot. I broke into a jog, rounding the final curve of the trail and immediately stopped. The parking area was almost empty. My car was still there along with the older couple's SUV, but the orange-clad hiker's vehicle was gone. More importantly, the registration board at the trailhead had been ripped from its post and was lying face down on the ground. Every registration card was missing. I hurried to my car, unlocked it, and climbed inside before locking the doors. Only then did I allow myself to breathe normally. As I started the engine, I glanced into the rearview mirror one last time. At the edge of the tree line, barely visible between two pines, stood the same man I'd encountered 3 times that afternoon. He wasn't trying to approach my car. He simply watched me leave with the same expressionless face. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station, where 2 park rangers listened carefully while I described everything that had happened. They took the story seriously enough to contact local law enforcement, and within an hour several officers returned to the trail with me. The fishing line and the note were gone. So was the abandoned pickup truck. The old campsite contained no knit cap, no cigarette butts, and no fresh footprints. It looked as though nobody had been there for weeks. The officers searched until after dark without finding anyone. Before I left, one of the rangers quietly asked me to step into his office. He opened a filing cabinet and removed a thin folder that looked years old. Inside were reports from other hikers. Different dates, different trails. Yet several details were identical, unexplained whistles. A middle-aged man carrying an unusually empty backpack, and handwritten notes left where victims were certain only they would find them. None of the witnesses had ever learned his identity. The ranger admitted there had never been enough evidence to charge anyone with a crime. The report stopped abruptly 8 years earlier, and everyone assumed whoever was responsible had either moved away or died. My encounter was the first similar report they'd received in almost a decade. I tried to put the experience behind me after that. Months passed, then years. I never returned to that forest, and eventually the memories became easier to live with. One rainy evening, nearly 4 years later, I was cleaning out old camping gear in my garage when I found the backpack I'd carried on that hike. As I emptied the last pocket, a folded piece of paper slid onto the floor. I didn't recognize it. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a recent color photograph of me unloading my backpack at the same trailhead on the morning of that hike. The picture had been taken from behind a tree only a few yards away. Written across the bottom in black ink were 6 simple words. You never noticed the second person.